What is up, Watch fam? Happy Wednesday, and welcome to this week's episode of ASKTNH Live. I'm Christian from Theo and Harris, and today we are live again on Instagram. So let's do it. All right, before we jump into it, a quick wristwatch check. I am wearing, I think, my Cartier tank, a Musta Cartier. Beautiful watch, very small. Most people would consider it a woman's size. I happen to think it looks quite, just gentlemanly on my wrist. I think it looks pretty classic and old school. I'm a big fan of it. I know that you guys sometimes have strong opinions about small watches. I know a lot of bigger guys think it looks awkward on their wrist, and I can totally understand that. But for people that think that they could be on the borderline, give it a shot, and don't just look at it or try it on once. If you're gonna give, small vintage watches a real shot, give them a real shot, wear them for a couple of days, because at first, anything is going to shock your eye. My dad recently bought a Panerai radio mirror, which totally shocked his eye for the first day he wore it. It wasn't until really day like 3 that he said, oh, it's actually not as large as I thought it was, so it does take time, and now he loves it a lot. Same thing for me with vintage watches. I remember when I got my first vintage Cartier Santos, I said to myself, whoa, this is small. And it is a small watch, but now I would go, smaller, just because your level of comfort changes. It's the same thing with fits and clothes. I mean, you think a slim fit is super tight first time you try it, and then you realize, oh no, but this just fits better. This is just more true. Anyway, that's just my little rant about pushing your boundaries, how comfortable you are with size. That's an interesting question. What are your thoughts on vintage Russian watches? I only know one real big fan of vintage Russian watches. One person that really looks at them and says, and can really wax poetic about them and mean it. I agree with almost everything he says. There is some supreme interest and some supreme rarity and importance to the watch world in the vintage Russian watch market. That being said, that sounds like a recipe for success on the secondhand market, but that doesn't always, mean it will be. Ultimately, it's still a Russian watch, and I have no problem with that, but I know that even Japanese watches have a hard time, breaking through the whole not being Swiss thing. But at least watch people know that that's the number 2, as in perception, not as in quality. They could be very well number 1. But Russian, I feel like because it's not even on the map, they could double, triple, quadruple in price, but they'll still be under $1,000. Most of these really cool, watches are $200, $400. I know that he said not too long ago, the most expensive and extremely rare, like Grail Russian watch that he bought was like $450. Which is hysterical because that barely gets you a halfway decent Swiss vintage watch. So it's kind of cool. Black Bay bronze or original? Good question. Bronze, I think, is pretty interesting and cool. I like the Black Bay bronze. I like any watches that experiment with metals. I like metals. I like textures. I think that's pretty. It's a pretty interesting way to experiment within reimagining a watch. That being said, I think that when Tudor announced their Black Bay bronze, it wasn't overplayed at the time. It didn't say we're unoriginal, whereas Audemars Piguet re-releasing their, Royal Oak in 1,000 different metals at this point is boring and unoriginal. It no longer comes off as interesting or inventive. So I think it's a very fine line. Ultimately, it doesn't speak to the actual quality of the watch. I think that the titanium and platinum, 15202 is just as good of a watch as it would be if it was an original piece. But now I think that the logic behind it, the story behind it is garbage. Okay, great. AP didn't know what to do. They didn't know what the to release. So they just released the same watch that works in a different metal. And frankly, I think it's uglier. So to me, that's a problem. I know a lot of people disagree with me. They just think you should judge watch quality. And I agree with that on many levels. But when it comes to these big brands, when it comes to, paying a premium beyond the material, I think that you are, as a consumer, you are well within your right to demand more thinking and just process, behind a watch. Whereas, just the platinum and titanium Royal Oak is just the same fucking watch in a different metal. So that to me, it's like, okay, let's just throw our shoulders up in the air and make this new thing people are gonna love. Are vintage DJs as underrated as vintage subs a time ago? No. Vintage Submariners will always have a greater appeal, or almost always have a greater appeal than Datejust. They're 40 millimeters, they're sports watches. Most people, the mass market, is more comfortable with 40 and sport than 36 and casual/dress. But that does not mean that the Datejust is not underrated. The Datejust is underrated, it's undervalued, it's underappreciated by almost everybody. So do I think that the best vintage Datejusts are going to reach the heights of the best vintage subs? No. The best vintage subs can go up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But that being said, best vintage DJs could still be underpriced by, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. I picked up a gilt vintage Datejust not too long ago for like over $10,000. I think it was like 11 grand. So there's no one to say that there's not more room. I just don't think that there's going to be the proportionate, exponential, multiplication here. The vintage submarket is out of control. It's crazy. It's the Bond watch. So, no, the answer is no. All right, one more question, and then we're gonna go ahead and sign off. What's the final one here? How about Bucherer? Let's talk about Bucherer for a second. They just bought out Tourneau. Who is Bucherer? Who is Tourneau? Bucherer is one of the biggest, or if not the biggest, European retailer for luxury watches, and Tourneau is the largest U.S.-based retailer for luxury watches. Tourneau has been having a lot of trouble for quite a long time now. At least, I gotta say, at least 3 to 5 years that I remember. Tourneau kind of being a more or a less admired place in the public's eye. People started shopping elsewhere. It no longer became Tourneau as the place you get a watch. Culturally, as a New Yorker, especially, Tourneau was massive in New York. When my dad was growing up, Tourneau was like the idol place. That's where you went. That was the dream. Not to walk into Rolex, but to walk into Tourneau. And now no one really gives a shit. So that's just kind of like a microcosm, like a cultural, example, this little example that speaks so largely about the brand's health. Bucherer is buying them out. Why? I guess for 2 reasons. One, they want to consolidate. The market needs to be consolidated. If the market's going to be so much smaller, it's got to be owned by fewer people. Otherwise, everyone's going to go out of business. So Bucherer, made the move and probably did the right thing. Tourneau probably also did the right thing because at least now they'll get something as opposed to just fading off into the abyss of debt and irrelevance. What's interesting though, what I can't wait to see, is what is Bucherer going to do differently? Are they going to improve the Tourneau business model? That's interesting. Is there room for improvement? Sure. But is Bucherer the person that knows how to do it? Does Bucherer know how to be Tourneau better than Tourneau? Or does Bucherer just have enough cash and balls to say, F it, we'll acquire you? So that's an interesting question. And we won't know the answer for a couple of years until the effects of the buyout really start to show themselves. But that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching this episode of AskTNH Live. I will see you all tomorrow on Lug to Lug.